What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be taking a deep look at the cluster mine in Modern Warfare 2, simply because I've been running into these more and more often lately, and I personally just wanted to understand them a little bit better and see what kind of counterplay they have, because I'll admit I have been having a bit of a hard time surviving these cluster mines lately, and I just wanted to share everything that I learned with you guys today. And starting it off, let's have a look at the basics of the cluster mines and how they work. So with this kill streak, when you throw it down, this is what I like to call the base station. That's what I'm going to refer to this as, at least throughout the rest of this video. That is the center part that you actually throw down, and once it lands on the ground, then it shoots out 4 mines. And all of these mines, as well as the base station itself, are explosives that will be triggered when an enemy comes within 5 meters of them. So that is the trigger radius. Keep in mind that does have to be within a line of sight, so if you're around a corner to it but within 5 meters, it's not going to go off. It has to have a line of sight to the enemy within 5 meters. And something I found quite interesting is each of these individual mines and the base station, they deal less than 100 damage to enemy players. Even if you're standing directly on top of them, one single mine or even the base station is not going to be enough to kill a full health enemy. However, it will get you down to very low health, or if you're already hurt and you run into one of those, of course, then it will kill you. And with that in mind, just a little tip with the cluster mines, if you are somebody that's using the cluster mine, typically you want to place this in areas where the mines don't have much room to spread out a bunch. Instead of putting them in an open area where the mines really shoot out far from the base station, I actually found it's better to be placing them in a more tight area where the mines don't have room to spread, and therefore when somebody triggers it, they're going to be triggering multiple of these at the same time, and that will allow the cluster mine to consistently kill the players rather than just hurting them. Now, another interesting thing to point out here is if you destroy that base station, this has no impact on the mines themselves. For me, my assumption was if you destroy that center base station, then it also disables or destroys the mines, because it appears that the mines are communicating with that base station in some way, but that's not actually the case. You can destroy the base station and the mines will still work just fine as they are. And it is also worth noting when it comes to destroying these, each of them appear to have 100 HP, and therefore it's not just going to be like a one bullet kill on them like it would be with a claymore or a proximity mine. You're going to have to put a few shots into them with most guns. And what that also means is since all of these have 100 HP and they all deal less than 100 damage, they actually don't destroy each other. If you just trigger one of these and it explodes, and one of the other mines is within the explosive radius of the mine that exploded, it won't actually cause the other mine to explode. So there isn't like a big chain reaction causing all of them to blow up at once. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion for me came in with the cluster mines is I would die to it once, in a small room, for instance, where they're all clustered pretty close to each other, and therefore I would think, well, that area must be safe now because obviously there was a big explosion there that must have taken care of all those mines, but that's not actually what happens. Those mines will survive the explosion from other mines in the vicinity. Additionally, another important characteristic to note here is the cluster mines will only survive on the map for a total of 2 minutes. And after that 2 minutes has elapsed, they will just detonate themselves. And that's good to know if you see a cluster mine in an area, for instance, and you just decide to avoid that area for a bit. When you come back to that area 2 minutes later, that cluster mine will be gone. So there we go, that covers it for the important characteristics of the cluster mine and how it works. Now let's talk a little bit about counterplay to the cluster mines. And the first very important factor to note here when it comes to counterplay is there is a distinct audio cue if you get within 15 meters of the base station. And this is what that audio cue sounds like. So if you see somebody on the enemy team has been using cluster mines, you really want to pay close attention for that audio cue. And if you hear it, that means you're within 15 meters of the base station. Now, unfortunately, this audio cue is only emitted from the base station itself, not the individual mines. And if you destroy the base station without destroying the mines, like I said, those mines will still work just fine, but you won't be able to hear those mines at all, unlike the base station. Additionally, when it comes to detecting the cluster mine on top of this audible sound that comes from the base station, we do of course have the spotter perk, but the spotter perk in this game is still incredibly weak. I'm not too sure why they haven't decided to buff this at all. This can't be a very popular perk in its current state. I don't think many people use this at all. And one of the big reasons for that is it's still very hard to see equipment through walls when using spotter. So I wouldn't necessarily even say that Spotter is a great counter to the cluster mine. To top that off, based on my testing, there are no hard counter perks, so there's no perk in the game that prevents you from triggering these cluster mines if you get within 5 meters of them. Also, the Flak Jacket perk doesn't reduce damage at all from kill streak damage, and that includes the cluster mine, so that doesn't help you at all against a cluster. However, we do have some counterplay in the form of our field upgrades. First up, we of course have the DDoS field upgrade. And with this, if you get within the radius of the cluster mine, it'll show you that there are devices in range, you can activate it, and all it will do here is it will temporarily disable the cluster mines. It doesn't destroy them, it just disables them for approximately 6.5 seconds, so that would give you plenty of time to run through that cluster mine area if that's what you wanted to do with the EMP. Additionally, you can throw a trophy system in the direction of the cluster mines, and that trophy system will sort of trade off with the cluster mines that are in its radius when you throw it. Now, this won't be enough of a radius to typically cover all of the cluster mines there, but it might deal with 1 or 2 of them if you throw a trophy system at it. And then I also wanted to test some lethal equipment. You would think the Molotov might be the best bet here because it does deal the biggest area of effect damage, but it turns out the Molotov only deals damage to the cluster mines when it initially hits the ground. The burn damage after the fact doesn't apply to the cluster mines at all, and therefore the Molotov is not a good counter here. It doesn't actually destroy the cluster mines with that burn damage effect. But of course, the explosive lethals are fairly effective against this, like a C4, a Semtex, or a Frag for instance, that can be pretty good at clearing out at least some of the cluster mines. So really, at the end of this, I didn't discover too many amazing counters to the cluster mine. There are a few options for some soft counters, but there's really nothing that I would consider a good hard counter to the cluster mine killstreak in this game. And this is where I just wanted to share some of my final thoughts on the cluster mine in the game. Personally, now that I've gotten to understand how these mines work a little bit better, and I now understand that a single mine isn't going to be enough to kill a full health enemy in core game modes, it's actually not quite as bad as I thought, and I do feel like I'm now equipped with a bit more knowledge to better deal with the cluster mines in a game. Having said that though, I definitely wouldn't be opposed to just a little bit more counterplay in some way. I'm not calling for like a massive nerf or anything, I'm just calling for maybe a little bit more counterplay, like perhaps a spotter perk buff. I think this should be done anyway, regardless of the cluster mine. I just think that spotter perk could use a buff so then it's a slightly more attractive option in general. Instead of having it so it's hard to see things through walls with spotter, which is the primary purpose of using spotter, in my opinion, it should be really hard to miss seeing equipment through walls if you've got this perk equipped. Instead of a very faint outline of equipment and streaks through walls with this, I think it should be glowing bright red so it's hard to miss things, because then that actually justifies using that perk. Additionally, I think I talked about this when I talked about claymores and bouncing betties as well. I think there should be a characteristic applied to at least one of the perks that will at the very least delay the trigger of the explosives. I think this would work really well on Tracker. Again, I think Tracker is one of those perks that not a ton of people are using. I don't think there's a lot of utility there compared to the other perks in the tier. So adding a little characteristic here, like the delayed trigger of a cluster mine or a claymore or a proximity mine, I think that would be great. And if anything, I feel like it would just encourage a lot more perk and playstyle variety. So there we go, those are just my opinions on the cluster mine in this game. I still find them to be fairly annoying, but at least now that I'm armed with a little bit more knowledge of them, I don't think they're going to be quite as bad to deal with. Of course, I am really curious to hear from you guys though in the comment section down below. First up, what are your general thoughts on the cluster mine in this game? Do you guys think they're balanced just fine as they are? And then on top of that, do you think there should be a little bit more counterplay to the cluster mines as well, by perhaps buffing one of the lesser used perks? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.